truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, sir.
All right, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Doctor, will you tell the jury who you are and where you work, please?
Absolutely. My name is Lora, Lora Darrisaw, Darrisaw. I work for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the GBI.
And what do you do at the GBI?
I'm a medical examiner at the GBI.
Will you tell the jury a little bit about your background, your education, your training to be a medical examiner?
Yes, ma'am. I received my Bachelor of Science degree in Electrical Engineering from Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I then received my medical doctorate degree from the Medical College of Wisconsin. Following that, I did 4 years of residency training in pathology at the hospitals of the Medical College of Wisconsin, which trained me to be a general pathologist. And then I did specialty training in pediatric pathology at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. And that was a 2-year fellowship. And then I did 1 year of specialty training in forensic pathology, and that was at the GBI through the Medical College of Georgia.
And how long have you been a medical examiner with the GBI?
Since 2004.
So about 20 years.
Yes.
Your Honor, the state would tender Dr. Darrisaw as an expert in forensic pathology at this time.
I'm familiar with Dr. Darrisaw, there's no objection.
All right, the witness is so qualified.
Thank you, Your Honor.
And actually, I think it was 2002. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh,
2002.
22 years.
Yes.
All right. Can you explain to the jury just briefly what the duties of a medical examiner are?
So yeah, primarily the duties of a medical examiner are to examine people who have died in certain circumstances. Generally, the circumstances are that individual has died suddenly and unexpectedly, or has died from unnatural type events, such as traumatic events. And the purpose of the role of the medical examiner is to determine the cause and manner of death by doing an autopsy.
Tell them also what an autopsy is, since you mentioned that, please.
So an autopsy is an examination of a person who's died. There's 2 major components to the autopsy. The first component is the external examination. The external examination is very similar to the type of examination that we get when we go to the doctor as live people. We get our height and weight taken. The doctor examines our external body, and that's what the pathologist does. And then in an autopsy, there's also an internal component. And with the internal examination, the body is cut in such a manner as to remove the organs that are in the body cavities to evaluate those organs. And then, like I said, the purpose of doing the external and internal is to determine the cause of death and then a manner of death.
Okay. And when you do an autopsy, what sort of clues are you looking for that can tell you the cause and manner of death? I realize that's a long list, but could you just give us some examples?
Yeah, sure. Briefly, so to even begin an autopsy, we begin with information about the death, the circumstances of the death. And that is the same as when we go to the doctor. We have to tell the doctor why we're there. We have certain symptoms. There's a reason for us to be there. And that's the same with an autopsy. There's always some degree of information of the circumstances of the individual's death that we have to start with. Some of those circumstances are obvious in terms of the cause of death. We know that a person has gotten shot, and so it's kind of obvious that they died of potentially a gunshot wound. And in that instance, the autopsy documents the wounds, provides vital information for court purposes in terms of getting the bullet, for instance. In some instances, a person may die in bed, and we get information from family members about their history, and then that may give us clues as to why they died. So we always have to start with some pieces of information concerning the circumstances of that death.
All right. And is looking at someone's medical history a normal part of performing an autopsy to see what sort of health they were in?
That's correct.
Moving to this specific case involving 20-month-old Quentin Simon, After remains were found in this case, do you recall being consulted by members of the district attorney's office?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and did they come and meet with you and show you photographs of what there was
That's
as far as
correct.
remains?
Yes.
Okay. And then, are you aware that those remains went to the FBI,
Yes, ma'am, I am.
to a forensic anthropologist?
That's correct.
Okay. After the FBI was done, were the remains sent to your office?
Yes, following the FBI examination of the skeletal remains of this child, I did receive those skeletal remains, and my examination was limited because the FBI was primarily involved as anthropologist, and I'm not an anthropologist. So my involvement in terms of evaluating the skeletal remains was inventorying the bones that we received.
Okay. Now, in a situation where the remains are primarily bones, would you be able to perform an autopsy?
No, not in the sense of obviously what I've just described to you as a complete autopsy on an individual who, let's say, is an intact body. So when there's only bones, there's going to be very limited ability to be able to provide enough information to say how a person has died.
Okay. And so is it normal in the situation where the remains are basically bones for a forensic anthropologist to be consulted?
Yes.
I would like to talk to you about one specific potential cause of death, and that is what is commonly known as sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, as people hear it called. What is the medical term for that?
So SIDS is Sudden Infant Death Syndrome. That's the acronym for SIDS. And SIDS is a definition of a death. It's not anything that one finds in a child. So it's a very strict definition. SIDS is defined as a death in a child who's 1 year old or less, whereby the autopsy doesn't identify any specific cause of death. The autopsy doesn't identify an infectious disease process or trauma. So we call these negative autopsies. And so the autopsy is negative. In addition to that, the definition of SIDS also requires that the investigative information doesn't reveal any suspicious circumstances surrounding the death, or the investigation doesn't reveal any, for instance, in a sleep environment, not an unsafe sleep environment that may cause a child to asphyxiate or suffocate. So it's very strictly defined as being a negative autopsy in a certain age, 1 year old or less, and no suspicious circumstances.
Okay. So a 20-month-old child would be too old to fall under the definition of SIDS.
That's correct.
Give me just 1 minute. Just to go a little bit further regarding the skeletal remains, in this specific case, you were not able to perform any of your duties beyond just doing an inventory of the bones. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And in this case, this wasn't just like remains found lying out somewhere. They had actually been in a landfill and had damage done to the bones.
Correct. Subjected to, environmental damage as a result of being in the landfill.
That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Dr. Darrisaw. How are you?
I'm good. Good afternoon.
So when you received the remains, you weren't able to conduct the normal autopsy, so you couldn't remove any of the organs or tissues or anything like that because you just didn't have them.
Correct.
And if I'm understanding correctly, did you receive any tissue samples, or was it just the bones you received?
So in the inventory, everything came to us from the GBI, packaged in bags and multiple bags. Mostly everything was bones. There was small material that could not be definitively identified as organs or skin, but there was some degree of what we would identify as soft tissue.
Okay. So there was some soft tissue then.
Yes,
Okay. And did you perform any testing or anything on that?
I did not know.
Okay. Were you asked to?
No, sir.
Okay. And I was just curious. You said that, of course, in this particular case, when you say you perform an external examination, I assume that means you would look at the body in its normal state in a normal autopsy, correct?
In a normal autopsy, yes.
Right. And that wasn't possible here, right?
It's correct.
Okay. And same thing with the internal examination. Again, you'd see a normal body and you would be able to look, I'm not trying to be graphic, but you'd split the ribs and the cranium and be able to pull the organs and tissues out as needed, correct?
Yes, we make the routine cuts to gain access to the organs in the body.
Okay. And again, you weren't able to do that here.
Correct.
But you also mentioned the other thing a minute ago to Ms. Parker, that you were told the circumstances surrounding the death. I'm curious, were you given any of the circumstances surrounding the death, or were you just given the bones and the tissue sample?
No, I knew the circumstances surrounding the death. Our office was initially informed of the death in October of 2022, that the child had been missing for a period of time, and then the skeletal remains had been, or some of them, the whole body was never recovered. Skeletal remains had been retrieved. I got the bones to look at. Basically, my looking at them was limited, and that was in March of 2023.
Okay. And you mentioned one thing, Ms. Parker, too, was talking about asphyxia or suffocation. We understand 20 months old is a bit old for SIDS, correct?
Correct.
But it's not too old for us to asphyxiate, correct?
It depends on, asphyxia is a very broad term. So asphyxia can be choking on a foreign object, for instance, either a food object or a toy or something like that, or a child can be intentionally suffocated. So asphyxia is broad, and a 20-month-old is not too old for
Well, then let's break it
that
down.
in the broad sense.
Then let's break that down. What's the definition of asphyxia, so we can start there then?
Asphyxia basically means a lack of oxygen for a variety of different reasons. You may not get oxygen because of a certain position you're in, where your nose and mouth are obstructed. You may not be able to get oxygen because something is obstructing your airway if you choke on a piece of food or something like that. So it's very broad, meaning a lack of oxygen to the brain.
Basically just means a lack of oxygen.
Correct.
It can be because you're choking, it can be because something lodged in your throat, it can be because somebody's strangling you. It can be for any of those reasons, but that's all asphyxia means, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, and would it be, do you think it would be important for you to know that and you said the other thing you investigate when you're talking to Ms. Parker was about the sleeping area. Would that be something you would need to know for a 20-month-old death?
A lot less important in a 20-month-old because a 20-month-old is able to turn around in bed and move around. They're not as immobile in a sleeping environment as a younger infant.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. At 20 months old, what is a normal 20-month-old's capabilities?
Generally 20 months old, they're able to walk. They're able to roll around in bed and turn from side to side and lift their head. So those are things that they can do.
Okay, so they're ambulatory.
Correct.
They can move and they have their own mind about things, correct?
Correct.
All right. So in this particular case, would it have been relevant to you to know that there was vomit in the playpen where the child was sleeping?
It would have been a piece of information. If I had a autopsy to perform on an intact body, the information about the scene itself would be information that we received that we would take into account.
Was that information that was passed along to you or no?
I'm not aware of that. I'm not sure.
Okay. All right. And that being said, I think that's all the questions I have. Thank you, Dr. Darrisaw.
Sure.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor, thank you. May she be excused?
She certainly may. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Your Honor.